Well, it was nearly Christmas in 1944 when a force of American troops were enveloped in a siege at the Belgian town called Bastogne. They were outnumbered 5-1 by German forces, but they'd been holding out for 2 days already. On the second day of the siege, 4 German soldiers approached the U.S. battle lines waving a white flag. They had come with documents that offered the leaders of the U.S. forces a chance to surrender. Otherwise, the German forces intended to start a relentless artillery barrage that would result in heavy losses both for the American troops and also the civilians living in the town. Eventually, these documents reached the commanding officer of the U.S. forces, Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe. It was read to him as he was climbing out of his sleeping bag, and he asked, "They want to surrender?" His subordinate said, "No, they want us to surrender." To which McAuliffe famously responded, "Us surrender? Ah, nuts." Now, just as a clarification for anyone younger here, when we say, "ah, nuts," usually means we're disappointed or something like that. But in that time, it was more like, forget about it, or go kick rocks, or that kind of sentiment with that word. McAuliffe was very confident that the Allies were winning. He was confident that he and his men could hold out until help arrived, even if they did start barraging them with artillery. So McAuliffe sat down with his officers to decide what they should write for their response to the Germans, and his officers said, "Your initial response would do nicely." And everyone thought that was very funny. So they typed up an official document that said, "To the German commander, nuts." Yeah, sincerely, the American commander. The Germans were quite puzzled by this, and after some colorful explanations from the American soldiers, they carried the message back to their lines. Thankfully, the artillery barrage never came. It turned out that the Allies were winning in other areas of the famous Battle of the Bulge. And so the Germans actually commanded their artillery to another part of the front lines. And only 4 days later, General Patton would arrive and break the siege of Bastogne just after Christmas Day. And so even though things were looking extremely grim for him and his forces, McAuliffe was able to open his eyes to the wider view of the battlefield of the war, and he knew there was still value in his troops holding out in Bastogne, so he didn't surrender. I imagine that wasn't as easy of a decision as it may have seemed with his initial expression. If he had just looked at the situation around him in his army, he might have thought, they're losing that war. They're outnumbered 5-1. They're surrounded. Their supplies were running low. It would have been easy to convince himself that he'd be better off just giving up. Why undergo all that trouble? Why let your men die when it may be for nothing? But he held on, and it paid off. Sometimes we have to look beyond our situation to see what is happening in the wider world so that discouragement doesn't get the better of us. In our scripture reading today, I think John the Baptist was broken down and discouraged by his situation. He was hemmed in on every side. He was being pressed and persecuted. I think he was wondering if anyone was coming to help him. So we're going to take a look at why that was, and we're going to take a look at what it means for us. We've been studying through the book of Luke together, seeing Luke's historical account of the extraordinary life and ministry of Jesus right here in our ordinary world. For the last month or so, we've been studying Jesus' sermon on the plain, and last week we finally finished it. We did it. We made it through chapter 6 of Luke, even though it took like a month. Today we're embarking on Luke chapter 7, and we're starting in verse 1. Now, our passage today begins with Jesus going to Capernaum, which was a major hub for his ministry in Galilee. This picture here is the excavation of the synagogue in Capernaum that was built in the 4th or 5th century AD. And actually, it was built on top of the remains of the synagogue that was built in the 1st century AD. It's likely that This synagogue was built on the remains of the very synagogue where Jesus was teaching in Capernaum. It's pretty cool to see it right here in our world. Let's start reading in Luke 7, if you'll turn with me to verse 1. When Jesus had finished saying all this to the people, that's the Sermon on the Plain, he returned to Capernaum. At that time, the highly valued slave of a Roman officer was sick and near death. When the officer heard about Jesus, he sent some respected Jewish elders to ask him to come and heal his slave. So they earnestly begged Jesus to help the man. If anyone deserves your help, he does, they said, for he loves the Jewish people and even built a synagogue for us. Now, this was an extremely unusual situation to be taking place in the first century. The Jews did not like the Roman occupiers, and generally the feeling was mutual. But that synagogue that is underneath the one in this picture was likely built with the money of this Roman centurion that we're reading about in Romans chapter 7. This centurion is likely what they would have called a God-fearer, right? A class of Gentile who sought to follow God even though they weren't part of the Jewish nation. So they would try to keep some of the purity laws. They would, and there were certain parts of the temple that they were allowed to enter for worship. So these Jewish elders came on the behalf of this Roman centurion to ask Jesus to come and heal a sick slave, which it was unusual for a high-status Roman to care about the slave as well. So this is an exceptional individual, an unusual person. Let's see what happened in verse 6. So Jesus went with them, but just before they arrived at the house, the officer sent some friends to say, "Lord, don't trouble yourself by coming to my home, for I'm not worthy of such an honor. I'm not even worthy to come and meet you. Just say the word from where you are, and my servant will be healed. I know this because I am under the authority of my superior officers, and I have authority over my soldiers. I only need to go, and they go, or come, and they come. And if I say to my slaves, do this, they do it." When Jesus heard this, he was amazed. Turning to the crowd that was following him, he said, "I tell you, I haven't seen faith like this in all Israel." And when the officer's friends returned to his house, they found the slave completely healed. So this Gentile, the centurion, he understood Jewish purity laws, right? He understood that any Jew that entered his house would likely become ritually unclean, right? If they came in contact with anything that they touched, they'd be considered ritually unclean. They would have to go through purification rituals in order to engage in worship at the temple again, right? So Jews did not like going into the house of Gentiles, and they didn't like being in contact with Gentiles. And so he's saying, look, you shouldn't even come in my house. You shouldn't even come in contact with me. And look, I know you don't need to, right? So he asked Jesus not to come to his house, but just to heal him from where he was. He understood that Jesus had that kind of authority. And Jesus was amazed. There's not many times throughout the Gospels that you can see that Jesus was amazed. And really the only times were when it was people demonstrating a supreme lack of faith or really robust faith. And yet here it was from a Gentile and not from a Jew. And so we're told that the slave was healed in the end, and the faith of the centurion was rewarded. Isn't that interesting? Within the context of just this story, we could read all sorts of things into this about how if we want to get what we want from God, we just need to believe and understand like that Roman centurion does. But we have to be careful with that. Let's wait a little while before we jump into saying something hasty. Let's keep reading. Verse 11. Soon afterward, Jesus went with his disciples to the village of Nain, and a large crowd followed him. A funeral procession was coming out as he approached the village gate. The young man who had died was a widow's only son, and a large crowd from the village was with her. When the Lord saw her, his heart overflowed with compassion. "Don't cry," he said. Then he walked over to the coffin and touched it, and the bearers stopped. "Young man," he said, "I tell you, get up." Then the dead boy sat up and began to talk, and Jesus gave him back to his mother. I love Jesus' compassion here, especially that compassion for widows, for grieving parents. No one had to ask him. No one begged him, "Oh, Lord, bring him from the dead." Nothing is said about the extraordinary faith of this widow that Jesus healed or brought her son back to life because she believed. No. Luke doesn't talk about anyone's faith here. Instead, he said it was completely due to the compassion of Jesus. I don't think anyone was expecting Jesus to raise the young man from the dead, but there it was. And what does Luke say here in verse 16? Great fear swept the crowd, and they praised God, saying, "A mighty prophet has risen among us, and God has visited his people today." And the news about Jesus spread throughout Judea and the surrounding countryside. God has visited his people today. Truer than they even recognized. I want to take a moment to remind you all, this is a historical account. Luke likely spoke to eyewitnesses of this event. Right? Remember, Luke is taking a specific period in time and a specific location. We're in Capernaum. Right? This didn't happen in a back room under immense secrecy. It happened in public, in the midst of a crowd that watched it happen. Remember what Luke said at the start of his gospel. "Having carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I also have decided to write an accurate account for you, most honorable Theophilus, so you can be certain of the truth of everything you were taught." So Luke isn't just making up fun stories about Jesus that he thinks would be neat. This isn't like somebody writing a Marvel comic or a DC comic. Luke is writing an account of real events so that readers later on could understand who Jesus was, what he did, and what that means. And so we read that Jesus' renown spread across the countryside. The people who saw that, they went home, they told their family, they told their friends, they told so on and so forth. They passed it on. But one person who caught news of this was confused. The disciples of John the Baptist told John about everything Jesus was doing. So John called for two of his disciples, and he sent them to the Lord to ask him, "Are you the Messiah we've been expecting, or should we keep looking for someone else?" That's a weird thing for John to say. Isn't he cousins with Jesus? Didn't he baptize Jesus? What's going on, John? And you might be wondering, why didn't John just go see Jesus himself? Why did his disciples need to come and tell him what was going on? Wasn't he there? Well, you'll recall, by this point in time, John was in prison for things that he had said to Herod about his marriage. Right? Remember back in Luke chapter 3, verse 20, that John the Baptist was thrown in prison. So all this time that Jesus has been ministering, giving sermons, healing people, John had been languishing in prison. And so John is hearing all this news through his disciples, and they're excited, like, "Oh, he raised this boy from the dead. He healed the centurion's servant, and he didn't even have to go and see him, or he was healed." And there was John, Jesus' cousin, Jesus' partner in ministry in some ways, rotting in a cell. Did John the Baptist not have enough faith? If he had faith like the centurion, shouldn't he just be able to believe those prison bars open? I don't think that's what was going on. I think John was discouraged, though. Prisons back then were brutal. They essentially, often they would take old cisterns, like water cisterns, and they would repurpose them into prisons. So they were damp, they were probably full of mold, they stank, they were dark. And it's not like the prison would have staff that would bring them food 3 times a day and that they would get to go out into a yard and have physical exercise. No, they sat in that pit, and if the only food they got was what people brought them. If you got sick, they didn't take you off to a hospital. You just stayed in there until you died. And you'd better hope that someone loved you enough to come and bring you some medicine or take care of you. So I don't know exactly how long John had been in prison by this point, but I think he was starting to wonder, is this actually the guy? Right? Like he knew he had a purpose. He knew that he was a prophet. And he was preparing the way, but he was like, was I wrong? Is Jesus the guy? So he sent his disciples, and this was Jesus' response in verse 20. John's 2 disciples found Jesus and said to him, "John the Baptist sent us to ask, are you the Messiah we've been expecting? Or should we keep looking for someone else?" At that very time, Jesus cured many people of their diseases, illnesses, and evil spirits, and he restored sight to many who were blind. Then he told John's disciples, "Go back to John and tell him what you have seen and heard. The blind see, the lame walk, those with leprosy are cured, the deaf hear, the dead are raised to life, and the good news is being preached to the poor." And he added, "God blesses those who do not fall away because of me." Some of your translations might say something more like, "Blessed is anyone who does not stumble on account of me." Why would anyone stumble because of Jesus? So Jesus gives John's disciples ample evidence that he is indeed the one. He's healing people. He's preaching the gospel to the poor, right? The blind are seeing, right? It should remind you of what Jesus said in the synagogue at the commencement of his ministry back in Nazareth, right? "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim that captives will be released and that the blind will see, that the oppressed will be set free, and that the time of the Lord's favor has come." So before John's disciples' eyes, they're seeing the blind see, the dead are living, the sick are being healed, people are being freed from the oppression of demon possession. And they go back and tell John that. But there's one captive that hasn't been freed, and it's John. How do you think John felt about that? And all Jesus had to say to him was, "God blesses those who do not fall away on account of me." Jesus was trying to tell him that just because you're my friend, you're my cousin, my partner in ministry, doesn't mean that the plan in place is for you to be saved. And we know that John died in prison. We know that he was taken and beheaded. How do we justify that? That on the one hand, Jesus is doing all these good things for these other people, but John, a faithful prophet, is left to die. Jesus was trying to say, trust me. Right? Did John not have enough faith? John had plenty of faith. We know that. Did Jesus not have compassion for John? Sure, Jesus loved John. I don't know why, but Jesus was demonstrating he's sovereign over death. He has authority to heal people, to call out demons. He was the Messiah. He was God. Yet for some reason, at that point in time, John had to be in prison. And he didn't explain why. He didn't take John through the steps of how that was going to accomplish his purpose. He just said, trust me. Don't surrender. Don't give in. I know you're being hedged in on every side. I know you're suffering, and it feels like you're suffering for no reason. But don't give up. We're winning everywhere else. I know it looks bad where you are, but God will bless you if you don't fall away because of me. I think he was telling John to say, nuts to that. Nuts to surrender, right? Right? He was telling John, hold out. Today you might be in a dark pit, wondering, where is Jesus? And if not today, then someday in the future, you will probably find yourself there in the darkness, saying, Jesus, you're doing good things for all these other people around me. Why do I have to be in the pit? And you might not get an answer. But Jesus is saying, trust me. Don't fall away because of this. Look around and see all the good things that God is doing. And that is why sharing our testimonies, encouraging each other, offering these points of praise is so important, because it lifts our eyes up off of our problems. It lifts our eyes out of the pit, and we're able to see that Jesus is healing the blind. He's freeing the oppressed. He's doing his work in the world, even if it feels like he's not doing anything in ours right now. And that can be difficult. That's why we come around each other and we encourage one another. And you wish that Jesus would go to John in his brokenness, right? In his despair. But he just had that beatitude for him, those words. So I give those words to you today. God blesses those who don't fall, who don't give up. So let's trust him this morning. Let's pray. Jesus, thank you that you don't leave us alone in that pit. That even in that prison, you were with John. That the Spirit of God was with him. And even on that day where his life was taken from him, we know that his life wasn't taken in vain. We know that his life was held secure in your hands, God. We know that on that day when you return, he will rise again to life because he trusted in you. Lord, help us when we are in those dark places to turn to you. Help us not to turn away in doubt. Help us not to give in to despair, but help us instead to be filled with hope. And Lord, help us to turn to when we are not in the pit, when we are in the sunshine, and we're experiencing the joy and life of Jesus. Help us to look for those who are in the pit. Help us to go to them, to offer that encouragement, to help them lift their eyes up out of that and see what you're doing in the world. And help us to be present with them. And we pray this in Jesus' name.